What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Dragon Age the Veilguard. The long-awaited next entry into the Dragon Age series following, of course, Inquisition back in 2014. This game is trying to do a lot of things with changes to the formula that are expected given how long it's been, but are nonetheless certain to, I would say, split opinions on this one. But before we dive into that, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below to a video covering everything I go over. My Steam profile is public and linked below as well, though a couple more notes on this one in particular. We're obviously a few days out from the official launch of the game, which means that A, you won't actually see it on my Steam profile for a little bit, as if you are completely unaware, unreleased games are typically hidden in that way until they officially release, so I can see it, but you won't be able to. What's more, though, on the subject of the achievements, and obviously how I'm bringing you this review, that is because I got an early copy of the game that allowed me to do so. What's more, though, in the case of this game, I would say while the achievements mostly cover the main stuff, there's actually a lot of stuff they don't cover. So while my initial playthrough was like 55 to 60 hours, I didn't check the exact time, but it was in that ballpark, I did have to play through the game multiple times to see everything, and you'll see some of the footage from all of the different characters I played throughout the course of this review, which brings me to my next point, which is mostly that spoilers, obviously. Not so much in the intentional way, just that we're a few days out from launch, and specifics are obviously still murky, and I would really hate to be the one who spoils this for anybody, so I'm going to be doing my best to avoid that, but obviously there might be contextual stuff in the footage that is very difficult to avoid in any substantial way. So even though I won't be touching like major plot points or anything, that's still important to know. But from there, let's talk about what Dragon Age the Veilguard is all about. Now, obviously there's a big switch to a more action-oriented system that is different from even Inquisition, which, while itself more action-oriented than, say, Origins, still had a very tactics-based system, and I'm happy to report that while this does absolutely have much more of an action focus, it does actually retain some of that tactics-based system in a way that meshes pretty well with what they're going for here. So while I realize that change in direction won't be for everybody, I do think the way it is implemented here is solid and leads to a fun combat system that was fun to explore with all the different classes I played while, of course, checking out all the different story options at the same time. Unsurprisingly, there's a lot of options you have when dealing with quests and the like that lead you to big outcomes. Now, again, don't want to touch on that stuff in any great depth, but the blending of that choice and consequence, the lore of the Dragon Age series as a whole that I really love. If you've watched the channel at all, I'm a big fan of the universe at play here, and broadly, I think the game does a really good job with that, while also making combat more fun than it has been in previous entries, at the very least to me. Though I certainly wouldn't call the game perfect, I do think there are some points where it could have done better, which we'll get into over the course of this. So with that out of the way, let's dive into this thing. But first, a note on the technical state of the game. So let's talk about how this game is running and things I encountered. Now, as this is primarily a PC channel and I'm a pretty die-hard keyboard and mouse guy, you might be surprised to see some footage here that has controller displays, and that is because I mostly played this one with a controller. I was actually having some trouble with my keyboard specifically on this one, and I didn't really have the time it was going to take to fix it, so I swapped over to a controller that I have, which is not my personal preference, but, you know, is what it is. But otherwise, I would say this game ran mostly very well. Now, obviously, I haven't been able to compare notes with other people ahead of release, so I really can't speak on how well it's going to run for everybody else. But speaking for myself, I really didn't have any trouble with it, as they even sent over the driver for the game that was just released a couple days ago for the public, but they sent that over with the review copy, so I was able to install that and not have any issues that might have arisen otherwise. So mostly what I ran into in terms of problems were just real minor bugs, like occasionally some visual glitching, an animation playing out a little weird, etc. Now, honestly, probably the most consistent, annoying, like little technical thing was that when you interact with any object in the environment, like materials you're gathering or just looting a chest or whatever, sometimes the game is painfully specific about where you're standing when you interact with it, which gets a little annoying. But otherwise, happy to say it was running pretty well here, so hopefully that will continue to be the case after the game officially releases. Moving right along though, now let's talk character creation. So Obviously, there's a big focus on cosmetic character creation in this one. Truth be told, while I enjoy creating a character, and we'll talk about that a little bit, systems and mechanics and things are of much greater interest to me personally, and I know for a fact there's plenty of videos out there talking about the character creation system in depth already, so I don't really feel the need to do it here. But outside of that, I do want to mention a couple of small things just generally. Now, we can pick one of 4 lineages or races, that is humans, elves, dwarves, Kunari, and then customize them accordingly. Now, one thing that I thought was especially interesting outside of just the wealth of cosmetic options here, including a surprisingly cool hair system, they use this face molding system, I guess would be the way to put it, or like face blending, where you pick 3 default set faces for a character and then you can blend them together to make a unique face on top of adjusting all of the little individual aspects of the character you've made, which I thought was pretty neat overall. So honestly, pretty cool to me, but I fully admit my bar for character creation is pretty low personally. Now, the more interesting stuff to me that you'll also pick during character creation are your class, your faction, as well as the choices that were made in Inquisition. Now, I'll just start with this off the bat. I find what the game carries over from previous games underwhelming. It's probably my biggest negative for this game overall, which is that the stuff it brings forward and chooses to speak about from previous games is lacking, frankly. There's no other way to put it. So ultimately, you'll decide whether or not the Inquisition did or did not disband at the end of the Trespasser DLC, who your Inquisitor romanced, and whether or not they vowed to stop Solus from doing what he is attempting to do. And that's pretty much it. So despite characters we'll meet along the way, such as Morrigan, which has already been announced, they really don't comment much on those past experiences, which was a little disappointing for a game that otherwise I would say knocks the lore out of the park. Now, if I had to guess, probably just development reasoning. It takes a lot of effort to go through those choices and parse them, especially in regards to all of the choices you as a character could have made. But it is the one part of this game that genuinely feels lacking to me. Otherwise, though, in character creation, we also pick our class and our faction. Class is the 3 choices, as always: warrior, mage, or rogue. Each of them has 3 specializations. We'll get into that later. But important to note, they also fundamentally change the way your character plays. Each of these 3 classes has like a core moveset as well as resource generation that differs from the other 2, as you might expect. So even just broadly, they all play a little different immediately out of the gate, which helps them differentiate from each other, of course, in a more action-oriented game like this. But then we have our faction. This is both a big mechanical choice on top of a big roleplay choice as well, because your faction determines your backstory. It's the origin story of the character you just made and where they came from. Now, pretty much all of these have you, say, temporarily away from your given faction, which is what you're doing with Varric to kick off the story. Now, mechanically, these also have a few benefits to you, primarily a damage boost to a given enemy type. Now, purely from that mechanical standpoint, Grey Wardens and Shadow Dragons are typically the best choices because they give you a bonus to Darkspawn and Venatori, which show up the most. But each faction also gives you a little other benefit, like, say, increasing your base defense and health for the Grey Wardens, and in general just making you raise reputation faster for that given faction, but we'll get into that later as well. So broadly, I would just encourage you to pick the one that speaks to you the most in terms of roleplay, because the other part of the faction is the roleplay element. And this is actually the part of the 100% that took the longest, by the way, was seeing these unique interactions between different factions, because these are interactions you'll only see if you play as each faction. You'll get extra options and conversations based on the characters you meet who know who you are, which adds that little bit of depth. Now, personally, Grey Warden was my favorite, but that's about all I can say without spoiling things. Moving right along, let's now talk about difficulty. So there are a bunch of different presets for difficulty that you can choose from, but you can also pick a custom option that, of course, lets you customize the difficulty in a more modular way that is becoming more popular with games these days, and that I personally am a big fan of. I think this is the right way to go, especially for role-playing games. Now, I will tell you that while the game is very easy on Storyteller, it can also be very challenging on higher difficulties like Nightmare. As what these difficulties adjust is health and damage of enemies, sure, but also the tactics they use, how aggressive they are. the timings on things you have, like in terms of defense and avoiding things. All that to tell you, I think they did a good job with the difficulty settings here, which is good. Now, on the story side of things, I'm going to talk about the basic setup for the game and a few general things I liked and disliked. Again, not going into any great depth here, but even this might be more than someone wants to know ahead of release, so definitely skip ahead or skip past this if you don't want to hear it. Now, with that out of the way, let's dive into it. Following the events of Inquisition and the Trespasser DLC, Solas has fled to the Tevinter Imperium to enact his plan of tearing down the Veil. We already know from the pre-release, as well as just the game's Steam page, that this plan goes wrong. We interrupt Solas during his ritual, which unintentionally frees a couple of elven gods while trapping Solas. Now, we have to stop these elven gods trying to take over the world in a grand and terrifying crusade. Now, that's about as much as I want to say specifics-wise, outside of one or two things. So, for starters, I've seen some complaints that the Blight looks different or Darkspawn look different. That is directly tied to the story. Now, obviously, yes, the entire art style of this game is a bit different than the previous ones, and while I personally don't mind stylized realism, I do think it hits that uncanny valley for some people, which is why you often see it discussed in pretty, I would say, visceral terms. But the Darkspawn do indeed look different, and there is a story reason for that. And while, yes, sure, they probably just worked the lore around a necessary change, given their art direction, that may well be true, but I do think the lore explanation there holds up and makes sense, so I was fine with it. Now, more broadly speaking, definitely skip away if you haven't yet and you don't want any sort of spoiler, because I'm going to talk a little bit about the structure of the game's story, even if I'm not going to talk about specifics. So here we go into that. The story of this game has a few different branching paths. You could see basically everything in 2 playthroughs outside of the faction stuff, if, of course, you're willing to do some save scumming and making some different choices along the way. Realistically, I think 3 playthroughs is more likely for most people, especially in regards to seeing the game's variable and different endings. There are a few different primary endings, as well as a whole host of variations on those endings based on the choices you made as you worked towards that part of the game. I thought all of those were really well done. I enjoyed them. I thought they did a pretty good job of bringing all of their narrative threads to a close in what is clearly the close of this narrative arc in the Dragon Age series. And if you're willing to dig through content and find some secrets, which there is an achievement associated with, you can even find what is very obviously a setup for the next game, or whatever work they have in mind after this, which I tell you because they clearly have a direction in mind for this series from here. Now, just broad opinion-wise, again, I thought it was all pretty good. It's not as, say, complicated as a big CRPG with multiple routes through any individual quest. This is an action-focused game. The answer to most every problem is to smash your way through it with action-oriented combat. It's also worth a mention that the first several hours of the game are fairly linear before the game starts opening up, which we'll talk more about in the gameplay and world section, but I just wanted to mention that while the main story is mission-based and somewhat linear, there is a large exploration system outside of the main story where you're going to be doing everything else, and we'll talk about that here in a moment. But cumulatively, all the decisions and everything you can make, I thought they did a really good job with the system and everything they were trying to build. Now, as somebody who loves CRPGs, while I wouldn't consider this one in the vein of a game like Origins, I think this is the closest I've ever seen an action game like this get to being one, which was honestly pretty impressive on its own. Next up, just to throw it in here, because I know people will have questions, let's talk about companions now. So I want to start this by being very upfront with people. I am not a romance in video games guy. I don't get it. I know people get really attached to these characters and the romances you can have with them and even just their interactions and stuff, and while I can appreciate them, and I think if that's what you get out of video games, fantastic. Between that and the difficulty options, you deserve to enjoy the game you pay for. But if you want commentary on the complex interactions between who these characters are and how the romances feel and stuff, I'm just not your guy for that, and I can acknowledge my own shortcoming on that one. But I can nonetheless give a bit of general commentary about the ones I liked, etc. So right away, we've got Harding returning from Inquisition. I think they did great with her. All of these characters have a personal story arc, and as was seen in the pre-release material, Harding's is that she gains the ability to cast a bit of magic in relation to stone. If you've played a particular Inquisition DLC, you will almost certainly know where that's going. I thought it was cool. Happy to see Harding again. Then we have probably my favorite companion overall, which was Nev. She gives you a little idea about how mages can operate in Tevinter, and as a private detective, she handles all sorts of cases and stuff, and with this game's lore being what it is, and the magic and everything you can get up to, she has a really cool story involving, of course, everything to do there. And I think her story in particular captures a lot of the ideas and things that were conveyed about Tevinter previously before we had a game set in at least this part of the world. More on that in just a little bit. Then we get our third companion, Balara. She's a member of the Veil Jumpers, people researching and trying to understand artifacts and everything from Elven ruins, and I thought she was okay for the most part. She has a somewhat timid and unsure personality that I think is at contrast with the rest of the game and how serious all the events are. And she has this ability to give off like timid teenager energy, which just feels, again, a little juxtaposed against everything else. But otherwise, her actual story was pretty solid. And the problems she's facing are probably the most relatable to any given person, which I appreciated. Now then we have Lucanus. Lucanus, the demon of Virantium, the mage killer, is an Antivan crow. We rescue him from prison, actually, in order to recruit him, and he had a really great story. He's a really cool companion, has a thing for cooking and murder, and a couple other things going on that I don't want to spoil. Another really great companion. Then we have Davrin, a Grey Warden who is accompanying the last known griffin, which were thought extinct up to this point, but we find Davrin in the company of one, doing his best to protect it. I think Davrin was another great character. I love the Grey Wardens. Them bringing the griffins back into things as well adds some great stuff there, and he has some really great moments. And between him and Lucanus, I would say it's about a tie for best bros of the series, if you want to put it that way. Then we have Imric and Tosh last. So Imric was surprisingly fun. He's an older gentleman necromancer, which was honestly just kind of delightful. They take the subject of necromancy and add this like charming gentleman personality to it, which was a lot of fun, surprisingly. He was a really cool character. He has an assistant known as Manfred, which provides a certain element of comic relief, and his story as well was really, really cool. As while you fight a lot of undead throughout the series, you don't necessarily see a lot of the upfront and personal parts of how necromancy works and is treated and everything in this particular series too often, so seeing that front and center in a companion was fun. And then lastly we have Tosh, a Kunari who was brought to Rivain by her mother, who grew up with the Kun but didn't want that for her daughter. Tosh's story is really all about the struggle between the two distinct places that they find themselves in, that is the Kunari as well as the people of Rivain, and trying to make sense of who they are, following naturally a revelation or two. So broadly speaking, I think each of the companions has their own thing to add. Lucanus, Nev, and Davrin are definitely the ones I liked the most, but I think there's a lot of good perspectives there, some quippy remarks, some witty dialogue that the series is known for. And one thing I really did enjoy is that while there were, I would say, definitely a few moments with companions that made me roll my eyes, it wasn't uncommon for the game to then go on and like directly address that thing. So clearly what they said was very intentional. So there's a little bit of that humor there that I would say is present in the entire series, honestly, which was fun to see. With that out of the way, though, let's finally talk about progression systems. So progression in this game comes down to leveling up, getting skill points from an environmental puzzle you can do with Finn Harel statues, spending those skill points in the skill trees, specializing your character, getting combat up to par, the gear that you equip to your character to enhance that stuff, upgrading that gear via the caretaker or just finding more of it, those statues I mentioned, and then finally the faction merchants for any individual faction, which is going to help you with those previous things. Starting with skill trees though, each class has their own unique skill tree with 3 specializations. At level 20 you can just go pick your specialization. You don't have a quest associated with this or anything, you just pick it on the skill tree. And then parts of your specialization are locked behind level gates, level 30 and 40 in particular, with level 50 being the max. And while I don't want to get into extreme detail for every single class, I will say that I had a lot of fun with each of these skill trees, finding synergies and fun things to do with each one. For instance, I made a Spellblade Mage as my first character, because that's kind of my preferred playstyle, who wound up stacking like shocking and burning afflictions on enemies and really leaning into both damage over time, but also being able to set up arcane bombs just generally as a mage on enemies by hitting them, only then to detonate those bombs while also applying status effects effects all the way through. For the warrior, they get a lot of like hefty smash abilities that allow them to leap into the fray, do like big whirlwind AoEs and everything. And while that's the playstyle I enjoyed, you can also take them down the route of like a slight bit of necromancy magic, allowing them to like steal life and things from enemies while dealing necrotic damage, and then combining them with items. You can even cause a warrior to deal like primarily elemental types of damage in various ways, giving you a lot to build off of. And then there's the rogue. The rogue is great at applying things like bleeds or necrosis, or like poison basically, and has a bunch of unique mechanics as well. Like they can go fully in on their ranged attack, their bow basically. They can focus on tools, allowing them to set up like a turret with their specialization even. Or my preference, the duelist, which focused on not getting hit at all, so you can build up adrenaline, which increases your damage done and everything until you get hit, as the rogue is very highly mobile in comparison to the other classes just by default. So all of them have their own interesting skill trees, and it was fun to mess around with and build these. I had a lot of good times just messing around and trying to build an interesting character mechanically, and that's something I think this game does very well. Now, I do have some more to say there, but I will leave it for the combat section, so let's talk about gear. Gear comes in a few different varieties. It's important to mention that the weapons you find are dependent upon the class you picked. So while gear is set and you will find all of it in the same locations in every playthrough, what will change is that if you are playing a mage, you'll find staves and orbs and spellblades, whereas if you're playing a rogue, in those same locations you will instead find like light weapons, rapiers, bows, etc. Armor and accessories, however, don't really change. They come in light, medium, and heavy variants, and accessories as well. I want to call out the belt specifically because that is where the potency of your healing items come in, which took me a little while to figure out, so I'd like to save everybody the hassle there. But obtaining the base level of that gear is really only one part of it, because then we have to upgrade it, which comes in terms of its overall effectiveness, but also its rarity tier. Now, you're going to be able to find multiple instances of each of these types of gear, which is going to increase the rarity tier of that particular piece of gear, which will unlock more of the latent effects on that item, allowing them to be properly used. Now, we can increase the stats of the item itself by going to the caretaker in the lighthouse being our main hub. We can find mementos out in the world that we bring back to the caretaker to level it up, which allows us to upgrade the base item level, so to speak, for our individual pieces. Now, what this also does is increases the base level of items you'll find out in the world. So if you have the caretaker up to like a +3 or something, +3 is the level of those items you'll find going forward. And if you find a duplicate item after this, it will actually upgrade your current item to that highest level as well, saving you the resources from the caretaker, which otherwise requires you to spend resources to upgrade them. Also at the caretaker, at a certain point, you'll be able to enchant your items and gear as well, adding even extra effects on top of all that. And given the wide range of items and everything and things they'll do to affect combat, I do think they did a great job with this in particular. Progression feels fun, and while I'll be the first person to tell you I did prefer Inquisition's crafting system to this, I can see why they made the switch with this being a more action-oriented title, and I do think it works. Then we have those statues I mentioned, so there are like little statue puzzles you can find out while you're exploring, and they come in two types. One will increase your max health, the other will increase your skill points. You'll get a free skill point basically, so you'll definitely want to do those. They're simple puzzles, not really worth explaining too much. But then we have our merchants. So every faction has its own dedicated merchants. Now we're going to be exploring a lot. You will find other merchants that you can buy things from, including little like miscellaneous items that will permanently increase stats by a small amount, which is probably worth knowing. So the faction merchants are not the only merchants, but they are the most important ones. So when you sell valuables to a faction merchant, which is the only people you can sell to, it increases your faction rep with that faction. And that faction rep, on top of giving them other materials and gold, will allow you to increase the rank of that faction merchant up to a maximum of rank 4. This is going to decide what you can buy from that merchant, which is important for all of the reasons I've already listed, as it contributes to that global progression pretty well. Now, I do want to mention here that you can use a transmogrification system via the lighthouse where you can change the looks of not only your character, but the armor you have equipped based on styles and things you found. You can find just appearances to use, which is nice. Now, originally, I noticed that you couldn't change the color of any individual piece, but then I found out basically that a lot of these armor sets have different variations of color palettes based on the faction you got it from, so that's probably worth knowing. And just while we're here, you can change some of the lighthouse decor, like our main hub area. We'll find appearances and stuff for there as well, and that can also be adjusted, which is definitely worth knowing. But with that out of the way, let's talk about the gameplay and world a bit, starting with the structure of it. So, as I just mentioned, the lighthouse acts as our hub of sorts. This was effectively Solas's hideout while he was working on his dastardly deeds. We're going to be using it throughout the game, and it will adjust and change as we go. There's even a couple secrets in the lighthouse itself to be found, so definitely explore the place a little bit. And it's of course where our companions take up residence as well. So between being able to discover some things here, the ability to redecorate the place, the way your companions' rooms and things will change, the lighthouse is a bit variable, and you can change it to your own liking. Now, as I mentioned a bit earlier, while the main story is mission-based, outside of that, when you're not on those missions, there's a lot of exploration to be had. So we have the lighthouse itself, but then we also have a place called the Crossroads. The Crossroads is an exploration hub on its own, but it's going to facilitate our travel via alluvians to other areas. Now, once you unlock these, you can just go straight there from the main map. You don't have to travel through the Crossroads every single time, which would be annoying. But that's primarily how you're going to get to the other exploration hubs, which includes cities like a part of Minrathous, Treviso, the Hosberg wetlands, the Necropolis, etc. And each of those individual areas is a very, I would say, dense section of things like exploration stuff I mentioned, like finding some of that loot, chests, those statues, and doing side quests. Each of these areas has side quests that are available to you, and all I will say there is, as I mentioned earlier, you cannot do everything in one run. It is possible to lose the ability to do some of these side quests, and some only become available if you make certain choices previously, which is one of the ways you're going to feel a lot of that choice and the consequence that the game is going to revolve around. Now, I was pleasantly surprised by all the exploration and questing available, because between this exploration and the companion stories and everything, there's a lot of game there, while at the same time being much, much more focused than a lot of the meandering you did in Inquisition that really didn't add anything to the game. So even things like the side quests here have very specific stories they're trying to tell you, and it adds something to the game rather than just be go collect this or kill this thing so many times. Happy to see they did away with that. There's a much higher quality of content to go through here. And doing all that with your companions who will comment on it, you can increase their bond and romance them as you go, while also meeting all these merchants and exploring these cities, which had previously only been talked about in the lore, was really fantastic. Now, your companions do actually play a little more of an active role even here, as you can use powers from a gained companion to unlock a bit of exploration in any given area. For instance, Davrin and his griffin can attack certain hanging platforms to drop them where you can climb things. Balara is great at removing wards on magical things. Lucanus can reveal fade anomalies so you can traverse across them, and other little things like that. So companions do play a role even here, outside of combat and just exploration generally. Now, broadly, a few things that I liked here. I really enjoyed the exploration. I'm glad those hubs are there. I think the questing adds to the game. It was a very enjoyable experience, and I'm really glad they put those areas in. Now, a couple of notes here. For starters, I do think this game could have done a better job of exploring Tevinter. So we're going all over the northern parts of Thedas, not just Tevinter, and it was cool to see a lot of those places, but the place I wanted to see the most was the Tevinter Imperium, a place that treats and deals with mages in a much different way than the rest of the games we are used to, where they are effectively persecuted. And while we certainly see a little bit of that, I am a little disappointed they didn't go full, into it, and make it a more central pillar of what the game is about. Especially since I think they did a really fantastic job showcasing all of these lore elements otherwise. Not least of which because being set in Tevinter, where blood magic is prominent, was definitely an ideal time to lean into that, and explore different elements of it in a much more straightforward way. And that's the one thing I wish the game had expanded upon that they just kind of didn't. And yes, there is a story reason for that. I just find it disappointing personally. Now, all along that exploration and story missions, etc., we are going to be engaging in a lot of combat because this is an action game. So let's talk about some of that combat. As I mentioned, 3 classes, 3 specializations each, but with the ability to freely respec your skill tree and swap out gear anytime you're not in combat, it can be pretty easy to fully remake a character and try a different playstyle, so don't be afraid to mix things up no matter the difficulty that you are on. and find out what works best, not just generally, but also for you specifically. Now, right away, what I like about combat is that each of the 3 classes and all of their specializations feel distinct from one another, which I think is great for replayability in a game like this in combination with the factions. So a mage can defend themselves by throwing up either an orb or like using a little blink out of the way type of dodge. Whereas a warrior uses just like a basic dodge roll, but will also block with their shield, and a rogue can also dodge out of the way and is much more mobile in general than the other 2, but can also effectively parry enemies and interrupt what they're doing in order to counterattack them, which will prevent them from taking damage, which is important because the rogue's main resource is momentum, which they gain by hitting the enemy and not being hit themselves, and they spend that momentum on their abilities. Whereas a mage, of course, operates off of mana, and they have to be able to regenerate it. Different still is the warrior, who works off of rage. Now, rage is built up in combat but decays afterwards, so you have to work up to using your abilities in that case outside of some skill tree components that allow you to carry over some of the rage you've built up so it doesn't decay outside of combat. Meaning that each of these classes has different resource generation, different abilities, and different movesets that's going to make them all feel and play differently. So my Spellblade character was focused on those afflictions. My warrior character was focused on big charge attacks and then sweeping through with the warrior's abilities like Whirlwind or their big heroic leap attack before working their way up to the ultimate, whereas my rogue was all about hitting the enemy but not getting hit themselves in order to maximize damage for adrenaline. But in every one of those cases, you could respec and take it a different direction and focus on something else that class is good at, which is probably a good time to mention traits. So this game does only have the 3 primary abilities, an ultimate ability that you will gain ultimate for before you can actually unleash, runes you can activate from a dagger that you will get a hold of, with all of the runes having different effects for both their passive effect on your character, but when you activate them in combat, they can have extra effects, like Ravage was my favorite, which increases damage against health for 20 seconds, which was great for certain bosses. And those are abilities you're going to be like actively utilizing via the tactics system. But then the traits are where the other part of this comes in. Traits are effectively button combos that you unlock for that class, typically somewhere around their specialization or just as part of their core kit. So for my mage, this was something like their Spirit Blade ability, which allowed them to toss out a blade that triggered their Arcane Bomb mechanic on enemies, whereas for the Warrior and the Slayer specialization I was going for there, this would build up my charge attacks and add extra attacks to those charge attacks and things like that. So a lot of little abilities from other games like, say, Inquisition have been moved into just either button presses or button combos, which makes up the difference. And being able to activate those button combos and then use your abilities for bigger moments before unleashing an ultimate or activating runes, it does feel really solid. And this was something I was a little worried about going into the game myself, as that's quite the reduction. But it's because of how they've moved a lot of that stuff into other places, which I think winds up feeling really great, at least to me personally. Now, that's hardly the only thing. There are a few other things to know. Enemies can use either a barrier or armor on top of their health, sometimes both. These will block specific types of damage and are usually resistant to other types, on top of whatever that creature is normally just resistant or weak to, like any other RPG. So some skills and things will specifically note that they deal more damage or apply a certain status effect against certain types of armor, and then you can find gear and abilities that focus on one in particular, like say that Ravage rune for health. So always be aware, or at least try to be aware, of what type of enemy you are hitting, as well as if you are hitting a barrier, armor, or their health, as that matters. Because understanding that and knowing how to maximize damage against each one is going to contribute pretty heavily, especially if you're trying to play on a higher difficulty. Now, while the game is certainly action-oriented, and you've probably seen this on screen already, it does feature a real-time with pause system. That is to say, we can sort of pause the game and bring up a tactics menu at any time. You can also simply use these abilities via shortcuts and go full action if you want, but it's not necessary. You can pause and take stock of everything happening in combat in the moment and then pick these abilities. This is where your companions come in. While you don't have direct control over them, you can, of course, direct direct them to use their abilities at a given time. This is important because both you and your companions can apply primers and use detonators. Some abilities will apply things like Overwhelmed or Weakened or Sundered, which are all primers. And while they do things on their own, what they also do is set you up for an ability combo where either you or your companions use a detonation ability. Detonation abilities usually specifically detonate one of those previous primers. This will cause that enemy to slow down and deal both damage to it once it explodes, but also damage to enemies in a wide berth around where that ability combo was set off, which adds another fun layer to it, but does have the side effect of meaning that there are usually sort of like best companions to take with you at any given moment. So for instance, my mage would usually travel around with Lucanus because my Spellblade would apply Overwhelmed, which Lucanus had abilities to detonate, which was very effective for me, of course. So I want to give my overall impressions of that, and then I'll talk about a few things I didn't like here. So broadly, I thought this combat system was a lot of fun. More so than I was expecting, and honestly I think it is better than previous games which tried to balance tactics with action as well, to varying degrees of success. For me, this game has the best combat in this series, but to be fair, I play a lot of CRPGs with those more tactical systems and a lot more action-oriented systems, which I review a lot of that type of game as well. So this game, marrying those two systems in a way that feels like it makes a lot of sense, definitely works out for somebody like me. But I am fully aware it's certainly not going to make everybody happy. I am well aware of how people feel about Origins and its combat systems. But overall, I thought it was great. Now, I didn't love everything about it. Starting with basically just the aggro of enemies. So your companions are there, they can occasionally draw aggro, they even have abilities sometimes, like Navrin has a taunt, to draw enemies onto them and take up their time. But your companions don't have like a health bar or anything. They're never going to go down in combat, and when you use an ability, they basically instantly teleport to where they need to be in order to execute that. So you can give them direction, tell them who to attack just generally, and, tell them to use their abilities and stuff, and that's great, and it makes it feel more alive. But I would have preferred personally having to actually worry about them staying alive and not going down in combat. Even if they res to full health after, I think that would have been fine, or at least have it as an option. Another part of this, though, is that potions are just potions. Basically, every effect a potion can have has been tied to your belt item slot. Based on the belt you have equipped, potions can heal you, of course, but then also have a variety of other effects, which is fine, but mostly this is stuff just like applying a buff or something, and I would have preferred a more fleshed out system there that wasn't necessarily tied to a bit of gear, which felt just like a little bit odd to me, especially since it's not like you craft these potions or buy them. They are in jars in combat. You can find regular healing potions this way, but also ultimate potions that increase your ultimate counter, of course, which is fine. Even Inquisition had its like supply system that it had where you would find supply points here and there where you did essentially the same thing. It just felt a little weird to me. Now, given what I've said about the way companions behave, aggro on enemies can be a problem, especially with your limited potion uses and things, because oftentimes enemies will focus on you, even if you're like a mage, which makes early game mage probably very underwhelming, even though it gets really, really fun later on once you have everything working. Prior to that, mage starts out the weakest, I would say, which certainly isn't unusual for RPGs, but it doesn't feel great comparatively to, say, then roll a rogue and then do much better just by default, at least for the first like 10 to 20 levels. And a lot of that I think has to do with enemy aggro, because for starters, your warrior companions don't come until you're a fair ways into the game, like when you're like 10 to 20 at least, and they have the taunt skills you need in order to get enemies off of you, which means starting as a mage does not feel great. It gets to a place that feels super fun, but it starts off the weakest as a result. And I do feel like they could have solved that problem by simply introducing one of the warrior companions earlier, but I suppose it is what it is. Relatively minor quibble, but a slight annoyance nonetheless. Which brings me to the Steam Deck before we start wrapping this one up. So the Steam Deck, they are in fact verified over there, and I just wanted to verify the verification basically. Worked very well on Steam Deck for me, no notes. Controller support obviously, cloud support ran very well. You might have to adjust like one or two things just based on preference, but that would be about about it. Happy to see it get verified, as a bit surprisingly even to me, having played this basically entirely on a controller, I think that'll be a good place to play this game for people. That though brings me to my positives and negatives. So on the positive side, we have just the lore of the Dragon Age series. I love the universe of this game and how everything works, and seeing more of that and seeing it get expanded on was a real treat for me. I think they did a great job with that, and a lot of it is extremely interesting. As a result of that, the story and the characters that they've written to facilitate that lore is also a big plus for me as well. The choices and consequences you'll make along the way as you experience that story and that lore I also thought were well done, and I even had a blast with the combat. So frankly, this game has a lot of things going for it, and I think it did very well. Now, on the negative side of things, I think not importing more of what Inquisition did and the choices you made there is a little underwhelming. I think they left a lot of loose threads specifically from Inquisition that they just don't really bother to deal with, and I'm curious to see if they ever will. And while yes, I am fully aware that they sometimes put out like extra publications around the lore and stuff, like books and web series and that kind of thing, I would vastly prefer that to be in-game. And as a result, I do think it's a negative not to carry more of that forward directly in this game. Now, this other negative might sound a little bit weird, but your character is the hero and they basically have to behave as the hero. While you will be able to choose your conversation options and the tone of them, it's basically impossible to be mean to literally anyone, which is odd. Basically, the way that you can be mean, if at all really, is to just ignore them and not do their quests, which does have consequences that are not great, but even then your character is still portrayed as like the good guy. And while that might seem like a minor complaint, it does make it basically impossible to roleplay as someone who is like, hey, there's a world-ending problem, I don't care about your personal problems right now. Basically what I'm saying is I could have used a few more renegade options, I guess, to put it in BioWare terms. And then along with that, a couple of minor gripes in like combat and stuff that I mentioned here and there, the lack of lore really expanding upon the Tevinter Imperium and blood magic and everything was a little disappointing, but not the end of the world in light of how good they did everywhere else. So as a conclusion, the base game of Dragon Age the Veilguard is $60 US, and for that price, I think you're getting a great game that does a lot of things really, really well, that makes it, as far as I'm concerned, the best entry in the series, and frankly, my own personal game of the year. So probably needless to say at that point, I'm absolutely giving this one a buy. I think you should check it out. I think it's very good, and while I acknowledge that continual shift in direction from the original game isn't going to be for everybody, this is still a great game, and that is where I'm going to leave off this particular review. So I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. I'd love to know what you think about all this down in the comment section below. This one was a lot of work, but as you can see, as far as I'm concerned, it was well worth it. So with all of that said, truly just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.